Thank you so much, David. So today we are hosting David Basin from AIDRC Zurich. Thank you so much for accepting the invitation. And I'm going to introduce you and then you can kick off, David. So Professor David is a full professor of computer science at AIDRC Zurich since 2003. So his research areas are information security and software engineering, and he is founding director of the DISC, the Zurich Information Security Center, which he led from 2003 till 2011. Also, he served as editor-in-chief of the ACM transactions on privacy and security between 2015-2020, and of Springer Verlage's book series on information security and cryptography since 2008 till today. He has co-founded 3 security companies, and he's on the board of directors of Anapaya Systems AG, as well as various management and scientific advisory boards. And he has consulted extensively for IT companies and government organizations. So he is an IEEE Fellow and an ICM Fellow too. Thank you so much, David, again for accepting the invitation, and you can kick off.
Thank you very much for the introduction. It's really a pleasure to be here, here virtually. I've heard many good things about TII, and I'm excited to tell you a little bit about my work and also to explore possibilities for interaction. The work I'll be talking about is work with my group. On one hand, I'll talk a little bit about a security protocol model checker called Tamarin that we've developed over the last 10 years. And it's one of the leading security protocol analysis tools that exists today. And then I'll talk about a substantial body of work we've done studying electronic payment, namely EMV, credit card payment protocols, using this tool. Let me get right into it. So what is Tamarin? Tamarin is the name of our tool. It's not an acronym. Tamarin is actually a monkey. And we picked this name because we think the monkey is a very cute monkey. I hope you'll agree. But more seriously, Tamarin is a constraint solver. At the heart of Tamarin is a solver that tries to figure out what a network adversary can do, how it can interact with the protocol. And then around that constraint solver, we built a theorem prover. So it's a constraint solver disguised as a theorem prover. Before showing you how we analyze a payment protocol, I'd like to tell you a little bit about Tamarin. Not so much from the internals, the algorithmic side, but rather how one might interact with Tamarin and use it to reason about security protocols. So here I have this picture of a typical model checker. A model checker takes as input a model of a system and a property that you would like to hold of the system. In the case of Tamarin, it turns both into a collection of logical constraints, and in particular, it negates the property. And then it uses a dedicated constraint solver to try and find behaviors, so runs or traces of the protocol that are consistent with the system and satisfy the negation of the property, i.e. they violate the property. If it succeeds, that behavior would represent an attack. And as I'll show you in this talk, these attacks are serious. You can use them to actually attack actual systems in practice. Conversely, if you end up with an inconsistent set of constraints, that represents a proof. It means there's nothing that the adversary can do to attack the system, no matter how it interacts with the system. Now, the problem of protocol security in general is an undecidable problem. So Tamarin might run out of time or memory, or you might run out of patience if you use the system. But fortunately, you can interact with the system to interactively construct proofs or provide hints to the system in terms of invariance, which will allow you to prove that a protocol is correct. Let me say a little bit about how you would specify things using Tamarin. To use Tamarin, you have to specify 3 things. You have to specify the protocol, the adversary, and the properties. And then it'll end up showing that the protocol has the properties even when running in parallel with the adversary. These specifications of the protocol and the adversary are done in a formalism called multi-set rewriting. So multi-set rewriting is a little bit like term rewriting, if you know term rewriting, but rather than rewriting terms, you rewrite a multi-set or a bag of facts. So a fact you can think of as an atom applied to terms. So if you think about programming languages like Prolog, you might think about a Prolog atom, and the rules will explain how to transform one atom into other atoms. So here would be a rule. It's of the form left-hand side, actions right-hand side. And this rule would model, for example, a situation where we have a protocol automata for one of the different protocol roles, maybe the initiator, the responder, who's in some step, and there is some K input to the network. And this rule would say that in response to this K input to the network, this protocol automata can advance its step and learn the key K, so record the key K in its state, and then output ACK, output an acknowledgement. So this expresses a transition, and this transition is labeled by saying that this particular thread with the thread ID accepts the key K. So this is a rewrite rule, and this rewrite rule is applied to a multiset, which is a bag of facts. It's applied, for example, by having the left-hand side of this rule match some atoms in this multiset. So here this matches where K is instantiated by key and thread ID is instantiated by TID3, etc. So think about instantiation like in Prolog or in first-order logic or in some other logical formalism. Okay, then what we do is we take these facts out of the multiset and add in the instances of the right-hand side. So these facts here are replaced with out ACK and state TID3 is in step 2 and has learned the key K. So this represents that this bag, this multi-set of facts that model everything happening on the network. So the local states of the distributed agents running in the protocol roles and the messages on the network and the knowledge of the attacker. So we model how that global state of the system is transformed as different parties execute the protocol. So here we've seen one step of execution by one protocol automata, by one thread executing the protocol. And this transition is labeled that thread ID 3, for example, accepts the key. Okay, so this gives rise to a transition system that has a trace semantics. Namely, as you apply more and more rewrite rules, you get a sequence of multi-sets and actions. And the sequence of actions, this red sequence here, the sequence of these red things here defines a trace. And properties are defined over this trace. For example, one might want to say that if a key is accepted, then that key is a secret. Okay, so this is how we specify the protocol via a collection of such rules. So for example, for TLS, TLS has a client, it has a server, for example. This would be a specification of or a high-level view of the client state machine for TLS 1.3. And for each of these transitions, each transition would correspond to a multi-set rewriting rule. So here there are, I don't know, I'd have to count them, 15 or so, 20 or so multi-set rewriting rules. And that would correspond to part of a Tamarin specification specifying the client state machine. And similarly, we would also specify the server state machine. And then together that would give us a specification of the protocol. That might be 4 or 5 pages of input of rules. We can also specify adversary capabilities. So the default adversary is sometimes called a Dolev-Yao adversary. It's a network adversary who sees all traffic and records all traffic and can also be active and can build messages from things it's seen and play them out to different parties. But we can model very powerful adversaries in Tamarin. So for example, we might model an adversary who could reveal long-term keys or session keys or even corrupt random number generators and reason about the correctness of protocols under such strong adversarial actions. So here would be a rule for session key reveal, which is similar if you know about computational proofs of security to the Oracle session key reveal in computational models. It says if you have a state where some thread ID has learned a key, that key can be output to the adversary. It can be revealed to the adversary. And that action would be, this transition would be labeled session key reveal, that this key has been revealed for this thread to the adversary. So now we've seen how do you specify protocols? How do you specify the adversary? Now, how do you specify properties? That's done in a specification language that's basically a fragment of first-order logic where you can also talk about time points. You can talk about time points in the past. So it somehow is morally kind of like a past time first order temporal logic. So here, for example, to say that a key is secret, you would say for every thread ID for every key, and this means for every time point I, if at some time point some thread ID has accepted a key running the protocol, then it's not the case that at some other time point j, the adversary knows or has learned the key, and that's what this K atom represents. So if I say I've run the protocol and this key is a secret, then the adversary doesn't know it. And again, these properties are interpreted over traces. So here's a trace where somebody accepts a key. They've reached a step in their protocol where they say, okay, I believe this key is a secret. Then it's not the case that before or after the adversary knows the key. Okay, so I've explained a little bit about how you specify things with Tamarin. There's a whole interesting question of how Tamarin works internally to construct proofs in an infinite state space. I will not describe that for you, but I'll give you some papers at the end that you can look at. If you'd like me to tell you about that, you'd have to invite me back and give maybe a course on this. I'd be happy to do so. It's very interesting algorithmic questions of how you search this infinite state space. But instead, we're going to switch gears right now and look at EMV. EMV is a global standard for smart card payments. It stands for Europay, Mastercard, and Visa. So we're talking about payment cards like this credit card here. So there are billions of payment cards worldwide, and they use EMV. So here are some of the payment cards that use it. And it's a standard because even though these credit cards differ somehow in the protocol details, there are different kernels, different subprotocols for them. You want interoperability with point of sale terminals where you use your credit card. And of course, the banks need to be able to handle different credit cards. Now, very important is security. If we're talking about money, we require security. And the standard claims to offer a very high degree of security. Now, what does that mean? So if you purchase something of a low value, you need to possess just the credit card, but you don't need to possess a PIN. So in Switzerland, low value used to be 40 franc, which is about 40 euro, before COVID. And then after COVID, to stop people from touching keypads, they raised it to 80 franc. So most places in the world, it's around 80 franc, $80, 80 euros. But of course, if you want to purchase something really high, like up to your credit limit, which might be 10,000 franc or dollars or even more, there, of course, you need a PIN. Two-factor authentication, something you have plus something you know. So you use the PIN for security. Unfortunately, as I'll show you in this talk, high-value purchases are not protected by the PIN. The punchline is the PIN of your credit card is completely useless. And we found this out using Tamarin to explore the model of EMV. So we used formal methods to produce proofs, but in this case, we found counterexamples, and the counterexamples are really serious. So the take-home messages are, I'll describe, we developed the first comprehensive model of EMV, which is over a protocol of over 2,000 pages of specification. This was directly formalized in Tamarin as rules of the kind that I just showed you. And we found both old and new security issues, in particular, a number of ways to bypass the PIN on your credit card. We have some fixes, which we've disclosed to the vendors. We did responsible disclosure. And the main punchline is don't trust, verify. If you're building critical systems for payments, or you're working, say, in the blockchain space, or you're working on e-government or whatever, or defense systems, don't trust, verify. And everything I'm talking about here, there are a number of papers and there's videos and things like that, and you'll find them embrace.github.io. So I encourage you to look at you'll even find the Tamarin models for the things I'm talking about. Okay, what is EMV? EMV is a beast. It's over 2,000 pages, and there's no way I'm going to describe that for you. In fact, here I have a massive simplification of it, because there are different kernels and different variants, etc. I'm not even going to describe this in detail. I just want to give you a flavor of the protocol, and also a little bit of intuition on where problems might come in. Here we're modeling it as a three-party protocol. I'll tell you later on that there are other parties and they're relevant for security. Between the card, this is your card, the terminal you put your card in or you tap your card against, and your bank. So for example, I have a UBS credit card, Union Bank of Switzerland, but I might use terminals by any of a number of different terminal manufacturers. So here in Switzerland, you find all sorts of manufacturers. The bank issues the credit card. So the bank and the card, they share a secret, namely a master key, and they have a counter and a transaction counter, and they use it to generate a session key, a secret that they share. And they will use this shared secret to authenticate data. So authenticity is very important. One shouldn't be able to change transaction data. Now, as I mentioned, so these have a pre-established relation, but as I mentioned, there are all sorts of terminal manufacturers, and the terminal manufacturers don't have any pre-existing relations with the banks or the cards. And we'll see that to communicate authentically with terminals, public key cryptography is used. So the first point is there's two different types of keying infrastructure. There's shared symmetric keys, which are used to create session keys between the cards and the banks, but a PKI is used to communicate securely with the terminals. Okay, so how does this protocol look? There are 4 phases. In the first phase, the terminal will say, I'll just do this at a very high level. The terminal will say to the card, we have a payment. It's either contact, the card's inserted into the terminal, or it's contactless. And moreover, I accept different app IDs. For example, I accept a Visa or an Amex or whatever. And then the card will say, well, I'm actually a Visa card or I'm a Mastercard, so it'll send information on that. And then information goes back and forth. The terminal will say, for example, I'm a terminal in Switzerland. In Switzerland, we use the Swiss franc. They also have nonces, numbers used only once, which are supposed to prevent replays. Then very important is that the card sends to the terminal authentication methods. We'll see there's 2 types of authentication: how you show that the card is an authentic card, and how you show that I am the actual card holder of this card. So you authenticate the card and you authenticate the card holder. There are different ways of doing this. We'll look at that. And then the card sends certain information to the terminal. And here this PKI is used. So it sends a PAN, that's the primary account number. It's the card number when the card expires. And here I'm abstracting, it sends a certificate that's signed with a private key of a banking CA that binds the name of the bank to its public key. So a little known secret, actually it's not a secret, but it's little known, is that probably the most successful public key infrastructure out there in the world today is the banking public key infrastructure. And that's used for all payments and works fairly well. So there's a CA, and the CA will sign a certificate that binds the name of the bank to the public key. Then the bank will issue a certificate signed with its private key that binds the name of C, the card, to its public key and other parameters as well. And this is all sent to the terminal, so the terminal can thereby get the bank's public key and the public key of the card. Okay, so this is on the initialization phase. Then what we have to do is we have to authenticate the card. And there are different ways of doing it. In the past, SDA and DDA were used, now CDA is used. So SDA and DDA aren't very strong. SDA is quite weak. Namely, on the card is some data signed by the bank when the card is set up. So it signs the card number and the expiration date and some authentication parameters, and that's it. But it doesn't sign anything related to the current session. So that's quite weak. Dynamic data authentication strengthens that in that one signs the nonces with the private key of the card. So that's also signed. Stronger is something called CDA, and in CDA, various transaction data is also signed. Okay, so that's what's currently being done to authenticate the card and information associated with the card in the current transaction. Then comes cardholder verification. So how do we know that I hold this authentic card? And there's one non-digital way. So some parts of the world you have to sign a receipt. And that's as good as checking human signature verification is. It's not very good, actually. And then there are 4 digital ways. One is called plain text PIN. And that is you enter the PIN into the payment terminal and it sends the PIN to the card. And then the response is sent back from the card to the terminal. So if this were an interactive session where I was physically in front of you, we would talk about why this is really bad. And probably you can guess there are at least 2 problems with this. First of all, the PIN is being sent unencrypted between the terminal and the card. So it might be possible to overhear. But then the card says yes or no, But if you can somehow man in the middle of the connection between the card and the terminal, you can change a no into a yes. So plain text PIN isn't very secure, and we're going to see that later on. There's also an option where the PIN is enciphered using the public key of the card, and then the card says yes or no. That solves the first problem about overhearing the PIN, but you can still change a no into a yes. So that's online enciphered PIN. It's used in some places, but it's not very good. Then there's online PIN. In online PIN, you enter your PIN into the terminal, and the PIN is sent to the bank and checked by the bank. It's not checked by the card. This is actually much better. And finally, there's something called CVM, Consumer Device Verification. That's where we use my phone. So I use my phone, I tap my phone, and we have Apple Pay or Google Pay or Samsung Pay, and my phone authenticates me. So it authenticates my face or my fingerprint, and then I don't have to authenticate myself on the terminal with my PIN. That's very important. Finally, the transaction can be declined or authorized, and it can be authorized online or offline. There are some places in the world where point-of-sale terminals aren't always online, and therefore there are provisions for offline authentication. And the key point here is the terminal has to make a decision whether it says yes or no. And at some point, possibly later in the offline case, the bank makes a decision, yes or no. And here's the key point. They use different data for this. The terminal will use signed data, this SDAD, signed dynamic authentication data, that it can check because it has over the PKI the public key of the card. So the terminal can't check MACs that are made to protect data between the card and the bank, but it can check signed data. So it's checking the signed dynamic authentication data. On the other hand, between the card and the bank, they're doing MACs, message authentication code, using this shared session key. So they build an authentication cryptogram. This authentication cryptogram is sent on to the bank for checking, whereas the signed dynamic authentication is sent to the card for checking. And I'd just like to highlight that this is very delicate. So different data is authenticated in different ways to different parties. And this can lead to the fact that depending on what's authenticated, the different parties end up with different views of transaction data. And this can be a source of problems. Okay. So keep that in mind. That's the take home of all this detail. Different data is authenticated in different ways, and this can be the source of problems. So what problems would we like from banking? One would be that the bank would accept a transaction that's accepted by the terminal. So if you're at a store and the terminal says, this is a good transaction. So at any point in time, if the terminal accepts a transaction, then it's not the case that the bank declines it. If the terminal accepts, then you walk away with the goods. So if the bank were to decline it later, you would have the goods, but the bank would, but the store would be out of money. So if the terminal accepts, the bank shouldn't decline, unless, or some honest party like the bank or the card was corrupted. So we can also model types of corruptions. So what does this property mean? This property means you shouldn't have bad things like the following: the bank declining some transaction, here's a transaction number, but the terminal accepting it. This would be bad. And what we want to do is verify that all possible behaviors of the system, all these purple things, are not bad, they're all good. Okay. So that's how we would specify this property in Tamarin. Then we have agreement properties, and these say that the views of the parties agree. Here, I won't read the formula. You can read it yourself if you would like. But this is saying authentication to the terminal. This is the terminal's view of what's going on agrees with the view of the card and the bank. For example, the amount of data and the currency and the authentication methods in particular. So the way this is done is when the terminal reaches a point in its protocol where it says, okay, I believe a transaction is going on. So it commits to a transaction with some partner P, where P is either the card or the bank. Then previously that partner was running the protocol with T, with the terminal, and moreover, they agree on the transaction information. So that's all being said here, that if one party commits, the other party is running, they agree on the transaction information, or an honest party was compromised. There's some additional things here saying there's a unique commit for each accepting transaction, so data is also not being replayed. Okay, so you can, if you'd like, work out the formula for yourself or read the papers for more details, but this is formulating that the terminal's view agrees with the view of the bank and the cards. And similarly, we can say that the bank's view agrees with the terminal in the card. And we would have a very similar property, but that's important also to check. Okay, so now we have a model of the protocol. There's a model of the adversary. So it's a standard network adversary. I haven't told you about that. And we have properties. So we have the 3 properties I specified here, plus some sanity checking that the protocol can be executed to an end. And then we asked Tamarin, please analyze the protocol. And to help you visualize the issues, I've broken down the analysis into some parts. I've broken it down into the contact case, where you put the card in the terminal, and the contactless case, where you hold it nearby. And then we have the different ways to authenticate the card, SDA, DDA, and the stronger CDA, and the different ways to authenticate the card holder, if there's a plain text PIN or no PIN or an online PIN, etc. Okay, what do we see? We see that only transactions using CDA, the most modern way of authenticating the card, and online PIN or no PIN as a CVM, as the cardholder verification method, are secure. So this isn't too surprising. These old methods are very rarely used. And banks and terminal manufacturers know they should be using CDA. So what happens if you use other authentication methods? If you use plain text PIN or online enciphered PIN, then Tamarin finds some attacks, and these are these X's here. So it's finding attacks where the bank ends up with a different viewpoint of the terminal, and the bank may accept, but the terminal may decline. And this is precisely the PIN bypass attacks that I described to you, where the message from the terminal to the bank, from the terminal to the card reader, early in the day for me, from the card to the card reader, from the card to the terminal is changed, where you change the no into a yes. And this attack was discovered by researchers at Cambridge over a decade ago. Okay, and I'll say more about that. Also, transactions using these weaker authentication methods, they admit attacks where the terminal accepts them, but the bank declines them. So that accounts for some of these X's here. And we found some other attacks related to secrecy, where you could downgrade to plain PIN verification and read the PIN via man in the middle. That's what I talked to you about, plain PIN, that's bad because you can leak the PIN. But at least in the past, credit card manufacturers haven't worried too much about them, because all of them require man in the middling, the connection between the card and the reader. So this galvanic connection. So if you go to your local store with this setup, and when they give you the card reader, you slip in a little shim to read the card, probably they're going to be suspicious and stop you. Okay, so there are attacks, they're known, but they're difficult to carry out in the wild because they're very apparent. Now, this is for contact. The situation for contactless becomes quite different, though, and that's what's really interesting. So what does Tamarin tell us for contactless? It tells us that most Mastercard transactions are secure, and I'll come back to this later if that's really the case. But interestingly, most Visa transactions are not secure. Namely, the bank and the terminal can end up with a different view of the transaction, in particular, the cardholder verification method. Let me explain that, because that's kind of critical. So the card's choice of the cardholder verification method is encoded in something called a CTQ. So here's the CTQ here. And the CTQ is authenticated using some signed dynamic authentication data. So it goes into this D, which is signed. Now, if you could change the CTQ, you could change how the cardholder is apparently verified. But what's interesting is most Visa transactions don't use SDAD. So in certain cases, they don't use it. And therefore, this CTQ can be changed. And therefore, the cardholder verification method can be changed. And this means that the card and the terminal will end up with different views on how the cardholder is verified, whether it was done by entering a PIN or whether it was done using the consumer device. So here's my consumer device. So let me show you how that works. We implemented, so Tamarin gives us an attack, and we wanted to try and see if it's a real attack. So we built a man-in-the-middle architecture based on a relay. So what happens is when the terminal sends a command to the, so the way this works is we have two Android phones. One emulates a credit card, the other emulates a point-of-sale terminal. Okay, so when the terminal says to the card, actually the card emulator, we need verification, That's forwarded onto the card. And when the card says, well, this is a high value purchase, so you need a PIN, then the man in the middle will change this data, the CTQ, to indicate that online PIN isn't required because verification was done on the consumer device, was done on the phone. So my face was authenticated and I was authenticated there. So we use these two phones. So what this means in practice is if I find a credit card, or if I were evil and I were to steal a credit card, I could put one phone in my pocket with a stolen credit card, and I could use the other phone to carry out what looks like an Apple Pay or a Google Pay purchase on the terminal. And then these two phones could end up doing these changes. So these would talk over NFC, these would talk over NFC, and these would talk, the two Android phones would talk over Wi-Fi, and everything would work as described. I'm going to actually show you how that works, a little demo. So we registered ourselves as a vendor to try these things out. And then we tried these things out in the wild on real stores, but using our own credit card and doing it in a way that nobody was defrauded. And then, of course, doing responsible disclosure afterwards. So this is a SumUp terminal for a vendor. And this phone here is just handling communication with the SumUp terminal, because the SumUp terminal itself doesn't have a SIM card. Okay, so this is going to be the card emulator, and this is going to be the terminal emulator. And what's going to happen is we're going to do a high value transaction. So we're going to enter 200 franc, which is a high value transaction. You need a PIN for it. Then we're going to put this over the card. So the card is going to talk to this thinking it's terminal. We're going to put this over the terminal, and it's going to simulate a card, and various data is going to be changed. And then at the end, it says, it's green, it says payment approved, and it says here in German, Zahlung genehmigt, which means payment approved. So the payment was approved, although a PIN was never entered. And the card holder was not authenticated by the consumer device. So we bypassed the PIN. So this is pretty dramatic, and this really works. The PIN on your card is useless. So I've done a lot of work in the past in security and safety, and this is probably the most highest impact work measured on in terms of press coverage. This has been really interesting, and I've lost count, but there have been thousands of news articles on this. In pretty much every language I know. So I've looked in French and Spanish and Japanese, and I have Chinese graduate students who look in Chinese. We didn't try Arabic, but you might look in Arabic. Look for ETH Zurich PIN bypass, EMV, and see what you find. It really had very high impact. Also, of course, it resonated quite a lot with the banks and the card manufacturers. So our goal in my research isn't to break things. There are groups that really like to break things. We like to make things better. We like to work on tools to make things better. And of course, along the way, you find problems with things. And here the problem was that in Visa, the signed dynamic authentication data wasn't always used. So in some combinations, some modes, some particular cases, it wasn't used. So of course, we explored and then used Tamarin to verify possible solutions to this PIN bypass. And one fix is to have the card always supply it and have the terminal always verify it. And that can be done, there's some small technical details, by setting a certain bit of a certain field called the terminal transaction qualifier to 1. And then these checks will be made. And what's nice is this can be deployed on terminals without reissuing cards. There are 5+ billion cards out there. There are far fewer terminals. It does require reflashing the terminals. But that's easier to do than reissuing the cards, which takes years. I mean, cards can stay around for 2, 3, 4 years until they expire. We found some other issues. I don't want to go into the details here. Low value offline transactions on Visa or Mastercard aren't secure. You can have these situations where the terminal accepts and the bank declines. Some of these turned out to be much more difficult to fix. And would actually require changing the protocol itself. And this was kind of stunning, that some of these problems will be with us for quite a long time. One of the most interesting things we found is originally we modeled the protocol as a protocol with 3 different parties, the card, the point of sale terminal, and the bank. But it turns out that for the different kernels, the different sub-protocols, they actually have different payment networks. It's not just the internet. They actually have something called a payment network. And what's interesting with verification is you verify things at a given level of abstraction. In our first level of abstraction, we abstracted away the payment network. So attacks we found were real attacks, but it could be that you verified something, but you abstracted away possible issues with the payment network that themselves could be attacked. So we thought, well, why don't we try and include this in our model? And to our tremendous surprise, that also showed that there were some weaknesses that could be exploited by taking advantage of the fact that there were different payment networks. So here is one such attack that we found, and I would never have believed this. It just sounds completely crazy. If your man in the middle replaces the card application identifier, which says, for example, that something is a Mastercard, if you replace that by saying, well, this card is a Visa card, you can deceive the terminal into activating the Visa kernel and using the Visa payment network. So you can simultaneously perform a Visa transaction with the terminal and a Mastercard transaction with the card. And then for the Visa transaction, you can apply the previously described attack on Visa to attack a Mastercard. So using a weakness on Visa, you can attack Mastercards, which are actually using somewhat different protocols, by attacking the payment network. So again, this created lots of press and lots of interest, also from the credit card companies. So again, we work to improve things. I can't say too much about this because a lot of this is under NDA, but we've been working, and at some point very soon, some articles will come out of this. But based on all of this work and all of these problems with one of the EMV vendors, one of the major credit card manufacturers, we've actually been working to improve the EMV standard and to have it come with really verified proof such that these types of problems won't exist in the future. And I'm happy to say that this has been very successful. And this will eventually touch all of the credit cards in your wallet and used in the world today. So that's something that excites me very much, that our tools can be used for these types of applications. Let me draw a conclusion so we have time for questions. I was told 40 minutes and I think we're on time. So formal methods really matter. You can rob the bank with a theorem prover. I'm not saying you should do it, please don't. But you can really find issues in systems that matter, and even more importantly, you can improve those systems. The tools are sufficiently advanced that they can and should be used. So it's good hygiene when you develop complex systems to be clear about the system, about the adversary in which you expect it to reside, to be interacting with it, and the properties itself. And then it's not just about stating these things. You can use these statements, if you formalize them, to produce proofs or to find flaws. And moreover, you can use this to follow standardization efforts. So I've been working with different companies in the past, TLS 1.3, members of my group and ex-members of my group have worked on that standard and had a lot of impact there, on things like 5G authenticated key agreement, on payment protocols, on proprietary government protocols, etc. I don't want to say that we've solved all the problems in the world. There are many research challenges in doing this, which for me, this is a positive thing. Lots of things to work on. One is complexity. As I mentioned, the underlying problems are undecidable. So it can always be the case that protocols are correct, but we can't verify them. So we're working to improve the scope and reach and power of our tools. But the tools are very powerful already. And much of what I'm doing is education, so getting the message out. So I'm working on a book on this topic. I like to give at ETH and other places block courses and industry courses on this topic, because I think it really can make much of the systems out there more secure, can really make a difference. So those are conclusions. If you're interested in learning more, there's some general papers on Tamarin. The different things I've talked about have been published in Oakland Security and Privacy, where we won the Best Practical Paper Award. I consider myself more on the theory side, but sometimes nothing is as useful as a good theory. This won the Best Practical Paper Award at Oakland. And there have been recent papers on Usenix, for example, on this card brand mix-up attack, where you can use the Visa network for Mastercards, and other ways, very recent work, it hasn't even been published yet, of how you can induce authentication failures to attack these cards as well. So thank you. And with that, I'm ready for questions. Maybe I stop sharing so I can look at people who ask.
Thank you so much, David. Thank you so much for such clear and let's say impressive talk for us. I don't know if we have some questions. I mean, from the attendees, you can put them in the chat. Yeah, there is one up. So we have, okay. So the first question, is there any fallback between SDA, DDA from CDA for terminals compatibility or legacy?
Yes. So all of these insecure modes and authentication methods, etc., they're all there for legacy. So the most important thing for credit card companies is that is that payments can be made, because that's how they make money. And the most important thing for stores is that you can buy things. So they're kind of trapped in a world where they can't do a clean slate design. They always have to take into account the fact that there might be old terminals and old cards out there, and you'll see these in different places in the world. And this can lead to issues, not just that these old modes exist, but there might be possible downgrade attacks. And indeed, there have been downgrade attacks in the past. So there is fallback, and this is a problem.
Good. So yeah, meanwhile we receive a second question. I have one question, David, because okay, so here I cannot I mean, I can see clearly that, I mean, this work has been successfully tested with or this attack with Mastercard credit and Maestro cards. Of course, I guess you are going to extend this to other kind of cards like American Express, I guess.
It's delicate. We limit our testing kind of to do proof of concept, because you're always at the border of issues with hacker laws. And it was very interesting to test in different countries and things like that. So for example, when we had the SumUp terminal, just using the SumUp terminal for testing on our own terminal, on our own company with our own cards, strictly speaking, you're violating conditions of use. You know, in talking with legal counsel, even if we're doing things in the most ethical way with responsible disclosure, we really want to minimize the amount of testing we do for that reason.
Yeah. Another question. So what happens if in the middle there would be a network failure while online verification is ongoing?
That's a really good question. That's not something we modeled. We didn't consider in so we're talking about the payment network, because between the card and the well, even between the card and the terminal, you could think about intercepting, you know, suddenly jamming or disrupting what's going on the NFC connection. We did not. It was not part of our model. If you try to induce outages and exploit them somehow. In our model is the case that, of course, a network attacker can intercept traffic and not let that traffic go on. So we modeled that, but we didn't try and model crazy, you know, things with crazy faults where maybe half of a message gets there or things are scrambled or whatever. We didn't model them, but we did model a fairly powerful attacker who can intercept messages. So to some extent, that takes care of network failures.
Yeah.
We didn't go down and look at TCP versus UDP and things like that.
Yeah. I see. Another question. So is there any sign that the PIN bypass was used in the wide? Yes,
there are signs. It's difficult to get data on this, but fortunately we have good relations with at least one vendor because we were working on the redesign. They could see in their logs that we had bypassed the PIN. They could identify all of the PIN bypasses we did with their card. Yes, there have been exploits in the past.
Okay, thank you. Good. So I have another question. I'm willing to know a bit more because about, I mean, you present, I mean, the variant number one, you were talking about, I mean, the card brand mix-up, but then you said that, I mean, you can bypass the PIN via authentication failures, right? Yeah. So I'm willing to know more a bit about this. I don't know if...
So authentication failures could be, there are various different things you could do. For example, you can mess with the public key certificates and things like that, such that certain checks don't work out. And the question is, how do they default when certain, what actions do they take when certain checks fail? And the card manufacturers, in some cases, they're conservative because this looks like it could be a security issue. In the other case, they take decisions where they would like very much for transactions to go through, and then you might be able to downgrade things. So for example, you might be able to downgrade because of authentication failures to doing a signature on your device, on your screen. But if I sign things on my screen and I show it to somebody, there's no way for them to check it. Because even if, I can create my own GUI interface and it can even have a picture of my signature, and then I sign and they compare it against my signature, but I can put in whatever signature I want for your card. These are the types of things we did. We exploited the fact that in some failure modes, we could do downgrades, and these downgrades, we could do very simple social engineering attacks that were almost impossible to stop. Because, if you go into a typical store, the person at the store, they have no training, and you show them something on your phone, or they don't know that a PIN should be used, or consumer device verification should be used because it's high value, but then you show them a signature and it says it's approved, and they're just fine with that. Okay. So it's exploiting these different types of things.
Good. We have another question from the audience. Does the terminal save some transactions while network is disrupted? So enough time to leave the shop?
So there are different cases. There's the online case and the offline case. In the offline case, the transactions are checked with the bank whenever the terminal goes again online. So yes, it saves the stuff, and the stuff is saved in various ways. So for example, there are printouts of the transactions, and there's logging to help the store owner keep track of things for their own payments. So yeah, information is kept track of.
Good. Another question. So does the protocol with PIN differ from the magnetic stripe cards? Is the property verification applicable for such cards?
So we did not look at mag stripe modes because those are pretty much completely broken. You can clone them, and there's just tons of attacks on them. So we looked at the more modern incarnations of credit cards. There's tons of research, quite old, on mag stripes and card cloning, and I mean those are even worse because you can just clone a card, right? Whereas here you need to physically possess the card.
Good. Okay. Clear. Thank you so much for your time, David, and for your clear responses and for the quality of the presentation and the work. I would like to thank you on behalf of all the team here in Abu Dhabi, and we're gonna for sure keep in touch with the whole team here. And thank you so much again.
It was a pleasure.
And keep in touch.
I look forward to that.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye-bye. Thank you so much. Bye-bye. Bye.